Hello and welcome to So Now What with Gates Cambridge, a podcast tackling some of the world's wicked problems with those who are dedicated to doing something about them. I'm Catherine Galloway, and my guests, as always, are Gates Cambridge scholars working to make an impact in the lives of others. The instruction to lead, follow, or get out of the way has famously been barked by many a powerful white male leader, from US General George Patton to CNN founder Ted Turner. But what if we don't want those three options? With dominant big beast leadership styles having yet another moment across global politics, business, media and the cultural sphere, leading us willingly or unwillingly into some deeply concerning places, it feels rather urgent right now to discuss alternatives. What does a different style of getting things done actually do? Is collaboration and communication always wishy-washy, or is that just a story we allow ourselves to believe? And given the current context, where tables everywhere are taking a pounding, how do you lead a bunch of leaders? Especially if they're leaders with a capital L. Joining me on Zoom from London today, I'm delighted to welcome Jennifer Piscopo, member of the Gates Cambridge class of 2002, and sitting beside me at Bill Gates Senior House in Cambridge is Justin Wei, who's just finishing up his Gates-funded PhD as part of the class of 2023. Thank you both very much for being here.
Thanks for having us.
Now, Jennifer, you're a political scientist and a leading expert on leaders, specifically women's participation in elections and government in Latin America, the United States and beyond. Professor of Gender and Politics and Director of the Gender Institute at Royal Holloway, University of London, your research appears in top academic journals and international media outlets, but also gets you invited to the table with decision makers at the UN, national and local governments, think tanks and NGOs. Your next book, The Women's Rights Era, 50 Years of Gender Equality Advocacy and Reform, comes out later this year with Polity Press, and frankly, it can't come quickly enough. With 3/4 of the legislative seats in the world still held by men, you're asking us to think harder about who we vote for and where exactly that leads us. Justin, born and raised in Hong Kong, you're a historian of race and marginalisation, asking, like Jennifer, what happens when certain groups of people, through their gender, heritage, sexuality or the wider status quo, are prevented or prohibited from expressing themselves conventionally as leaders. Your Gates-funded PhD research looks at Black and Asian communities in the Britain of the 1970s and 80s to ask what kind of leadership was possible there, regardless of the wider social context of racism and hostility, and pushes for a conception of transformative leadership that includes artists, publishers, actors and community organisers, as well as the conventional alphas of politics and business. Yesterday's history and today's politics are obviously deeply interconnected, but you both also share a background in leading the Gates scholars themselves. Justin as president of the Scholars Council in 2025, representing over 250 current students, and Jennifer as a former co-chair of the Scholars Alumni Association. In other words, you both led groups of very brilliant and diverse people who were all specifically chosen for their leadership potential. We'll get into how on earth you manage that in just a moment. But let's begin with one thing you're bringing to the table today that will help us get started on our question. Justin, why don't you go first?
Thanks so much. I bring a reflection to the table in the form of an anecdote that sort of marked an important moment for me when I first started reflecting on my leadership style. So right before I started my PhD, between 2022 and 2023, I worked at a big British conglomerate on their accelerated leadership program. And so at the start of the program, we were all asked to take a psychometric leadership style test that would put us either on the dominance and influence side of the leadership spectrum or on the conscientious and steady side of the leadership spectrum. And when we all shared our results with one another, it was really interesting how out of 14 of us, 12 of us had landed on the dominance and influence side. And I was one of 2 people who had landed on the steadiness and conscientiousness side. And so they did a very good job of telling us that, you know, every leadership style can be successful, but I definitely felt a bit like I was a fish out of water in terms of whether I was going to be successful there. But I think over time, I've really come to embrace that as a signature of the way I lead. And so I bring to the table that sense of wanting to challenge the classical leadership archetypes that we carry with us day in and day out.
Thank you, Justin. Well, you're very, very welcome here. We love a bit of steadiness. Brilliant. Jennifer, what have you brought for us?
I'm bringing contemplation. It's the evening for me. And we did an event earlier this afternoon at the Gender Institute that I direct. And we were talking about how the failure of politics and practice to really bring meaningful solutions that people seek, creates this phenomenon where people then become desperate for easy answers. And then too often the vacuum for easy answers is filled by bad faith leaders that want to convince you that the easy answer is to blame or scapegoat a group of people that are different from you. And so this is a very tried and true story. I'm really contemplating, how do we make space for the people who still have real solutions and not the easy solutions that cause more harm. So I still want to think about how we do that.
Thank you. And Jennifer, when we spoke ahead of this recording, I think you summarised this as good leadership doesn't get the clicks. And that's exactly the issue. It's like we need good leadership. It is happening, but it isn't getting the headlines that we'd like at the moment. But let's dive straight into this shared experience for you both of leading Gates scholars who are by nature themselves all leaders. Justin, as you say, we very nearly lost you to the corporate world back in Hong Kong. And frankly, that is a loss for them. A bit more steadiness there, I think, would be very welcome. But you returned to Cambridge as a Gates scholar and ended up leading that very definition of a high performance team, the Scholars' Council. Tell me what you learned from that.
Yeah, so I think it's a really challenging role because you're trying to represent so many different interests. The definition of the role is that you're supposed to lead the delivering of social, professional, and academic programming for the community. But you're also in charge of scholar welfare. You interconnect very closely and interface very closely with the trust. So you're representing a lot of different groups. And as you've alluded to, this is a community that has all been selected by virtue of the fact that they're leaders, and they're leaders in different contexts and different cultures, which means that they also have different visions of what successful leadership looks like. And so you're sat here trying to define your own metrics of success as well. And for me, a couple of the big learnings are around what you can do to maximize your success as a leader within that landscape. And the first, I think, is really, really understanding how you provide value in terms of context, right? I think leaders are always interested in maximizing their productivity. They have big visions and, big dreams about what they want to do. But your job as a leader of those leaders is really to know the lay of the land, right? You're always enmeshed in contexts that are institutional. There are historical relationships at play that carry important valences with them. You have your own strengths as a leader, you have your own sensibilities as a leader. And so for you, the challenge is to say, well, how can I put all of those things to use in helping the leaders that you're leading to do their job? And as you also allude to, I think steadiness isn't sexy leadership, but you lead leaders by performing that sort of everyday governance, right? When you run meetings to time, people don't get burnt out. When you enforce group norms and you create a culture of collaboration and a culture of transparency where people can admit that they're facing challenges, all of those things win you goodwill that are important, when you make big decisions and you need currency to influence as a leader. And so those are two of, I think, the main takeaways. And I'll just end also by saying that leaders like to be met where they are. So they have their own styles, they have their own ways of working. And I think it's okay to say that not everyone has to be able to work together in a totally harmonious way. Some people are lone wolves, some people need a bit more support. And so when you're able to meet people where they like to be met, I think you end up with less resistance for the things that you have a vision for going forwards as well.
Well, word on the street, Justin, is that you were a very, very successful president of the Scholars' Council. So congratulations to you and thank you. Jennifer, does any of what Justin's saying resonate for you from your time chairing the Scholars Alumni Association? Because these are the scholars out in the wild now. How do you deal with that?
Yeah. No, I think everything Justin says resonates. And I'm contemplating, in the spirit of bringing contemplation to the table today, that in some ways our job with the Alumni Council was a little bit more straightforward. I think about leadership as a political scientist. And so what we're trying to do is solve collective action problems. And even leaders are going to have collective action problems. So what is a collective action problem? There's some outcome or good that everyone wants, but in order to achieve that outcome or good, some amount of energy has to be spent. And you need a coordinator, what we might often call a leader, who will come in, right, and decide the resources and the direction that the group will take, right, in order to get to the outcome. And you can think about this when you're with your mates, and people say, "Oh, should we go for pizza or chicken or ice cream tonight?" And just no one can decide, right? And so even leaders do need to be led, right? Even leaders need someone to solve their collective action problem for them. And what made the Alumni Council also straightforward was that Gates alums now at this point were off in the world and they were leading in their respective fields, but they still wanted to be back connected to the Gates, right? And so the collective action that we could solve for them was to create that alumni organization and provide that structure. And in some ways, these were leaders that were generally happy, although of course they voiced their own opinions when they didn't like what we were doing, but they were generally happy to be led and have this collective action problem of alumni connectivity solved for them, because that freed up their time, right, to work in their chosen fields and their chosen professions. And so I think part of what I think about as being a leader, but also being willing to be led, is being able to say, where do I want to direct my time to be the coordinator of solving this collective action problem? And where actually am I happy for someone else, right, to come along and help this collective action be solved so I can dedicate my resources the most successfully? And so I think perhaps part of also leading is showing what you can deliver to people that even a way frees them, right, to have this good created so that they can also go do the good that they want to do in a different sphere.
Hearing Jennifer's reflections on that has also been really helpful, because there's so much in what both were saying about leadership is also about letting go, right? Like, especially when you're leading leaders, it's not about taking control of them and holding so strongly onto the grip of what your vision is. It's saying you all are leaders for a reason. And so learning to let go can sometimes actually be the best way to lead those, capital L leaders.
The word that was coming into my mind as both of you were speaking and about your vision for leadership was scaffolding. It feels like you're the essential, steady strength there, but there's still space between those scaffolding poles that you're putting in for others to act. And without the scaffolding, obviously the whole thing falls apart and it's just chaos. It's not necessarily glamorous, but you're also allowing others to be their best selves, which is fascinating. Very briefly, Justin, I have to say, you can't help yourself. You ended up as the men's captain of your college boat club the same year last year that you were the president of the Scholars Association. And that's despite only starting to row at Cambridge. So how is captaining a bunch of rowers different from captaining a tribe of scholars?
I guess I'll start with the differences, but I think ultimately I want to say that there was more similarity between the experiences than differences. I think in terms of differences, in an athletic setting, there is both more and less flexibility. More in the sense that I think you can get away with more as a leader. There's something about direct authority in an athletic context that people respond to, I think, a bit more positively. But there's also a lot stricter a definition of what success looks like. There's a very strong results orientation. People get more emotional about what's happening in athletics and in sports than they do on a student government, body. And so that was interesting to work my way through. But I think there were more similarities than differences when I come back to think about it. The first big thing is really consistency. So when you show up every day as a leader and you do the very basic things that are required of you, when you make things easy for everyone else, when you set the training schedule well, when you send meeting minutes in the Gates Council context, so those are all similarities that help you build, trust and confidence with the people that you're working with. And I think a culture of care is also really important. It's expressed a little differently when it's a bunch of men who are big and tall and like to row and like to go fast. But when you express that you care for them, you care for their athletic success, you care for their academic success, you care for their pastoral success outside of the context of the sport, you build a healthier team environment. And that was true in the council context as well, certainly.
Gosh, yes, we'll get on to care and the culture of care in just a minute. But Jennifer, I want to come to you because in your policy and consultancy work, you step into some pretty big rooms, UN Women, the Organization of American States and so on, where you're not necessarily the most powerful, in inverted commas, person there, but you are the person that holds the information and the insight that they're looking for. And your role is often to steer that room into an appreciation of that information and ideally get them to act on it. So how do you actually go about that?
That's a great question. One thing I'm reflecting is that often what happens in policy meetings, whether they're in the international arena or whether they're in the national or local arena, is that they're probably not as conflictual as people from the outside think, right? I think when people think about politics, they're thinking about, if they're not involved in politics themselves, right, they have to imagine what it would be like. So they're thinking about TV shows or movies, right, where there are these conflictual meetings and people are yelling across each other at a table and people are slugging it out, right, to have their view or have their perspective. And it's true, I have been in some meetings where things have been quite contentious, but in all of my experiences, right, the actual meetings, right, the ones that are not televised, are collaborative, right? They are actually a really collaborative spirit, especially international organizations that are multilateral organizations. They are far more attuned to the importance of inclusion, intersectionality, diversity, and difference. And I think they're often credited with, right? They're deliberately creating tables where the representatives from the global south are able to speak, the academics are able to speak. That's not to say there aren't strong opinions. There's not to say that some of the issues are not very fraught and carry certain kinds of legacy and baggage that make them emotional. But there usually is a sort of baseline spirit of, let's hear this out and let's try to get to the bottom of the issues. And so then it really is about the things that Justin highlighted, right? You have to listen, you have to show understanding, you have to think about the things that people are saying and how you can position your comments and your ideas in a way that will resonate with their concerns. So I don't often, perhaps as my strategy, I don't often like to be the first person in the meeting that speaks, right? I like to speak in the middle or the end of the pack because I like to listen to what other people say. And of course, I have the things that I want to say, but what I'm thinking as other people are speaking is, well, what's their real concern? Right? What are they prioritizing? What are they worried about? How can I make my points resonate, right, in a way for them that they feel that if they listen to me, it will address their worries, it will address their concerns? Can I tweak my language a bit to say their words instead of mine in a way that will get through to them? And I don't think I'm alone in perhaps thinking about that. And we could say it's just strategy, but I think it's also a little bit, as Justin said, it's a little bit about care, right? Because you've demonstrated that you understand where other people are coming from and that you understand that they've brought an agenda that's really important to them. And rather than have your agendas compete, right? That's the Hollywood lens, right? The agendas are competing, but actually could the agendas move together?
That sounds really positive and lovely. But my question to you as a political scientist is, how do we say we want good and caring and compassionate and careful and thoughtful leaders, and we keep voting for the people who do the opposite? How does that happen? Where is that disconnect coming from? And importantly, how do we fix it?
Yeah, I think there really is a real disconnect, right? Think about the Trump on television, right? The Apprentice, the braggadocio, the just yelling at people, calling out their flaws, and then screaming, "You're fired." I mean, I never actually watched The Apprentice, but this is what I assume happened, right? And then in this show, right? It had wild ratings. It was massively popular. But then if you asked, does anybody want to work for a boss like that? And your answer would be no, right? That person is a sociopath. They're unpredictable. They're cruel. There's going to be low morale in the workplace. You would never know what you're supposed to deliver in order to make this person happy. So there is this real disconnect, I think, between this kind of fantasy of the sort of hyper masculine, cut through the nonsense leadership and the kinds of environments that even everyday people feel that they would be able to thrive in, right? Whether it's a workplace or a political space. And I think what starts to blur that line between the fantasy of Trump and The Apprentice and the reality of Trump and people like him in government is when people get frustrated, right? And as you know, as I suggested in the beginning, they start to feel that it's all very good if we're all sitting around at the UN and having these lovely collaborative conversations and come out with these beautiful, multilateral consensus-seeking documents, but then it doesn't actually change anything, right? And people's lived conditions don't get better. The cost of living doesn't go down. Their anxieties about their future and their children's futures don't go down, no matter how beautiful of a policy document we produced. And then I think it makes that what they can probably recognize in normal times as sort of just a fantasy, right? Yeah, we've all had that colleague that we'd love if the boss would just yell, "You're fired," because that colleague really annoys us, right? But then I think when you're more frustrated, you start to think, well, maybe that fantasy could work, right? You might know that it doesn't work, but the alternative hasn't worked for you either. So that fantasy starts to become more attractive, and people start to vote to bring that fantasy into reality, even if, it doesn't actually seem to work, and maybe they know it won't, but it's that they're desperate now for this alternative solution.
That's so interesting, that perspective on how we got here, which I haven't heard explained so clearly before. Thank you. Justin, we've been talking about leaders with a capital L, and of course history with a capital H is full of big, bold personalities of the type that Jennifer's referring to there, doing big, bold things. But that's clearly only part of the story, and that's not actually how things change profoundly very often. Can you tell me more about the figures your PhD research is looking at and what their ways of leading and living and surviving, even in a hostile moment, can tell us?
I've just been reflecting on what Jen has said, and I came into this project wanting to really focus on that element of Black and Asian interracial solidarity. But I think in the context of this conversation, it's been really interesting also to think about the way that specific kind of solidarity birthed a different kind of leadership that was important for the moment in which these activists were operating. And as Jennifer has also, spoken to us about, you think about history and you think about Winston Churchill. There's a whopping biography of Winston Churchill, probably many out there. There's a whopping biography of Steve Jobs, but there aren't whopping big biographies of specific community leaders with their face plastered on the cover. And I think part of it is because we identify some of these people as activists or as community organizers or as mothers, but we don't necessarily identify them first and foremost as leaders. And I do think history is slowly but surely shifting that narrative bit by bit. So I'm particularly interested about the Black feminist movement that emerged in the 80s in Britain, which was very much an offshoot from the earlier Black power movement that really was centered between the 60s and 70s in the UK. And the emergence of that Black feminist movement is very much a retaliation to the idea of Black masculinity and chauvinism that was in that kind of very large ideological movement. And a bunch of women said, you know what, this isn't representing what our communities need. And the kind of permanent erasure of issues of gender and sexuality are harming the people who are core to this movement. So we have a lot of community groups break out in the mid-1980s to say, well, actually, we care more about delivering services to our communities. So some examples include the Black Lesbian and Gay Center in Hackney, which opened in the mid-80s and was staffed by predominantly women of South Asian and Afro-Caribbean descent. We have women like Maud Salter and Lubaina Hamid who are leading the Black arts movement in this moment, and also, publishing in this moment as well. There's a particular group of women called the Sheba Feminist Publishers who actually start as a racially mixed group but move towards being a Black group focused on documenting Black histories. And so I think what we can learn from them about leadership is, well, first of all, they were very, very, very aggressive about we're going to make this happen whatever way we can. There's been a lot of debate about whether or not these groups should have accepted state funding in the mid-'80s. And a lot of them said, well, we're not going to be able to operate without state funding, so let's take it and we'll change things the way we want them to be, with or without this funding. And the second thing was that they were very conscious about documenting their own place in history. The push for publishing, the push for representation in the arts was so much about saying, if we don't document our own history, there's a chance that historians 10, 20, 30 years down the line aren't going to document our history, and that this success is going to become another capital H history lesson. And so it's been really, really inspiring to go through that and see not only were they fighting on all of those operational fronts, but they were also fighting a fight for the way that they were going to be perceived by generations of historians to come.
Justin, you used the word aggressive there in terms of how hard they were pushing to create that space for themselves and to say, here we are, we're doing it this way, this is what we look like, this is what we care about. And I want to talk about the B word to both of you. That's bossy, of course. And it's pretty much always applied to women and women trying to get anything done anywhere. And Jen, I know you've been watching Claudia Sheinbaum quite carefully, the first female president of Mexico, often described as the Trump whisperer. What's striking about her leadership style in this context?
It's a really gendered story, and I'm conflicted even about sharing why I think that she's good at handling Trump, because it just plays into so many gender stereotypes, and it reads certain stereotypical narratives about how men and women should act. It really reinforces them, right? So one of the things that Claudia Sheinbaum seems quite good at, right, is when she has these conversations with Trump, she plays to his ego. Right? So this is the gendered bit, right? She knows that he needs to be flattered and that he needs to feel like he's in control of the scenario or of the dialogue, even if he's not, right? So she is able to sort of play to his ego. She's able to flatter him. She is quite clever at offering him policy decisions that get phrased as concessions that are actually things that Mexico had already agreed to do, right? Say relative to immigration policy or policy around drug trafficking and security at the border. But she's clever enough to know to present them as if there's some new thing, right? That Mexico and that she is offering to him, right? So there's sort of an abasement that goes on that you could read in very gendered terms, right? She's the woman, she flatters his ego, she appears to concede, right? She does all of the things that play to this gendered narrative that Trump expects of women, right? And then she gets what she wants out of the conversation, because quite right now he's feeling quite warm to her. She's flattered him, she's conceded, he feels like the winner, he feels like he's in control, and then she gets him to agree to what she wants, and she takes that back, right? And she presents that to the Mexican public. And I think everyone sort of knows this is the game, right? It really does illustrate the sort of gender tropes that both of them are falling into. And so the conflict is, the feminist political scholar in me says what we need to think about is why, right? Like why this is happening in the first place, right? I don't want to normatively lock in this idea that sort of good leadership is needing to flatter someone, make them feel like they're in charge, deceive them, concede to them, and then, turn around at the last minute and pull the rabbit out of the hat. So I want to definitely problematize that. But insofar as when you're dealing with a figure that is known to be egotistical, and also known to have sort of an expectation, right, that women will behave to him in a certain way, you are, of course, quite clever to leverage that situation to your advantage.
Yes, I mean, hearing you talk about her reminds me of that proverb that you hear very often in Mediterranean countries too. The man is the head, but the woman is the neck. In other words, controlling the way that the head looks, right? But you're right. Is that our only option to lead? If we're not bossy, we're wily and conniving and, tricky.
I would hate anyone to walk away from this conversation thinking, that women leaders, meaning sort of women elite political leaders, all need to be sort of Wile E. Coyotes. And I think that, that description of Claudia Sheinbaum is very much a product, right, of the institutional environment in which she's forced to operate, right, being the president of Mexico, having the U.S. as her neighbor, governed by Trump in this instance. And of course, there are other contexts, right, where her leadership style is much, she's communicating directly, right, to Mexicans, and her leadership style is really different. But in this spirit of contemplation, it is interesting to think about leadership styles that have resounded in their moment, but don't seem to be resounding in this particular moment. So if the question is particularly about women leaders, of course, there has been other models, right? There was Jacinda Ardern, who was very well known and built a personal brand, right, around leading with empathy during her tenure as Prime Minister of New Zealand, right? But Jacinda Ardern, in addition to genuinely being an empathetic person, right, had the fortune of governing in a moment where empathy was positively received. Right. She governed during the pandemic. She also, early in her tenure, led New Zealand through 2 crises, a horrible terrorist attack, a mass shooting, and an earthquake, right? And all of these moments, the pandemic, the mass shooting, the earthquake, she really performed genuinely, right? Not just strategically, this empathy that was incredibly well received. Then you go over to Germany and you have the very long tenure of Angela Merkel as chancellor, who did not emote in an empathetic way. The way Ardern did was sort of well known for being more of a technocrat, a scientist, but yet had a moral clarity, right, in her position on key issues such as refugees, right, the environment that she self-consciously led with, even when it was unpopular. And so there have been these other models, and it's not just women that have had a lock on compassionate or empathetic or morally clear forms of leadership. It's often women. It's stereotypically consistent with what we expect of women. But it is interesting that these aren't the forms of political leadership that seem most in demand in the moment. These are forms of political leadership that are really draining, right? Ardern, even on her exit from politics, gave this really moving, again, honest, authentic, empathetic speech where she said, I'm paraphrasing, but she said something very close to this, I just don't have anything left in the tank. This kind of care-led leadership that even Justin is talking about enacting in his own life, it's draining, right? And so there's something about politics at the moment that is making it even more and more difficult for, I think, care-led and morally clear leaders to be present.
Justin, where do the female community leaders you've been researching sit on this spectrum? What were the conditions and the challenges of their moment in 1980s Britain?
So I guess as a corollary to Jen's very high politics answer, my answer is a very grassroots organization known as the Organization for Women of African and Asian Descent, which was founded in 1979. They were really that first group to stand out from that bigger British Black Power movement and say, we represent the women. And so I guess I preface this answer by saying that I don't think they led people that were bossier than them, but I think they led people that were equally as driven as they were in terms of trying to build a better world for what the Black feminist movement could look like. And so the group collapsed in 1983 because there were a lot of schisms within the membership. It was the first time that women across the Black and Asian ethnic divides had tried to say, let's organize together. There were issues about lesbian women not necessarily feeling super welcome in the group. The people who were at the head of this organization in oral history since have also said that, we were very democratic. We didn't have a very tight nucleus of leaders to direct where the group was going to go. And so my answer is that sometimes that version of leadership is generous. And in that generosity is sometimes also knowing when to let go and say, our organization has run its course, and the best way for things to evolve is if we let our members do what they want. And so that moment in 83 when the group collapses is so often seen as that last moment of, optimism for the movement. And it's not. the mid to late 80s has such a large flourishing of different groups that represent different specific interests within the community. And it's because those leaders of that very first group were able to say, we're going to let things go and we're going to let things run their course because we've outgrown, what we're able to do. And so sometimes leading the very driven people is also knowing when to move aside and say, someone else should take the reins.
That makes me want to ask both of you, is there ever a case for just walking away, therefore, or doing something so different and saying, this is me or this is us, we're not going to lead in a conventional way, follow us or not, but this is the deal? Is that successful, or are we always going to eventually say, this just isn't strong enough?
Catherine, I sort of think there's like a personal way to answer your question, right? Sort of that individual advice giving level, what I would say to other leaders. And then I think, there's me putting on my political science hat and having a political or social answer to that question. I think the personal answer, right, is that one thing I've had to learn personally is just because you can lead doesn't mean you have to. And having the choice to say, not my monkeys, not my circus, or these are my monkeys and this is my circus, right? And that they can't all be your circuses, because that is actually impossible for any human. So it's about saying these are the issues, or these are the arenas, or these are the spaces, whether it's Gates or politics or sports or your local book club, where that is your circus and that's what you care about. And then it's having the trust that for those other circuses that you might care about, but you might just care about a little less, that they'll have their leaders too. Because I think if you quickly try to lead everywhere all the time, you will burn out. Right. And so it is about feeling where you can make a contribution, what you want to prioritize, and leaving the things that, that you could do, but you don't have to do, and you could let someone else do behind. And that's the personal answer. I mean, I think the more political, social answer, what I see as a scholar of politics and the way people engage in movements or the way people enter politics, is we often find, and I think Justin's research even shows this, that he talked about earlier, that for many people, exclusion or threat or fear is actually mobilizing, right? That the stakes are so high, right? That being left behind, having your voice left out, having your voice as a woman of color left out by the civil rights movement, right? It's too high. And so you mobilize and you come to lead despite the risks and despite the costs. My colleague Julia Zulver has wonderful work about what she calls high-risk feminism. And it's studying women that are peace activists or activists searching for the disappeared in very violent contexts like Colombia or Mexico. And the question is, why, when this work is so dangerous, right, that the retaliation from the forces that don't want you searching for the disappeared or don't want you looking for peace, is that they will hurt you and they will hurt your families. So why do the women still do the work? And it's because the threat, right, the urgency of meeting the moment is so high. But at the same time, we also know that not everyone is able to do that. And we are in a fraught political moment, right, where there is a lot of threat to those who mobilize politically and to those who want to see themselves on the side of justice. And there are some people who will say, that's too much for me right now. I need to back away and I need to protect my space and my peace. And I also think when leaders retreat to restore themselves and work to fight the fight for justice another day, that's all right as well.
Justin, from your perspective, can putting down the baton temporarily or permanently also be a way to benefit a cause long term, or equally importantly, just be a good way to protect yourself as a leader?
I similarly to Jen have kind of a personal side to the answer and a more professional side to the answer based on my research. And honestly, what Jen said, I feel like I needed to hear at some points last year, which was to say that not everything is yours to fix, though I'm old enough to know that I can't really help myself sometimes. And that's a lesson that I think we all need to learn. But yeah, on that professional side, you hear the exhaustion from these people. And the magic about working on the 70s and 80s and 90s is that so many of these people are still alive and able to share about their experiences. And that emotion rarely comes through in the way we document our histories. And so to have their voices published now and to hear them say, yeah, we were really tired. Some of the reason some of these groups collapse is because they said we gave everything we could and we just didn't feel like we had anything else to give. But also, as Jen says, we don't always have the luxury to say, let's step back, because sometimes the moment demands us and we have to move forward. So to me, the answer is about how do we manage that kind of empathetic leadership so that it's not always exhausting for the people who lead, right? For me personally, a lot of what got me through last year was having really, really close friends in quarters where I was able to say, we're working together, and let me share with you someone who I can 100% share with, to say, these were the issues that I'm facing. I don't need you to give me any advice, but just for people to know that this is what I'm going through was incredibly important. And I think there's always that tension about, if you're an empathetic leader, people will take advantage of you, or that if you're an empathetic or kind leader, that you're a soft leader. But I think you can be empathetic to the people you need to be empathetic to, but still have a hard exterior and a hard shell, and to push back when you need to. And so finding that balance and to say, yeah, don't take advantage of my empathy, that's reserved for the people that I care about, is also something that sounds selfish, but is important to do as a leader.
Thank you, Justin. And I feel like that's something I needed to hear. Thank you so, so much for that. We have to wrap now, even though I'm absolutely loving this conversation. But Jen, I want to conclude by something that really made me smile during our prep call. You said, if I hear something about a leadership retreat, I immediately run in the opposite direction. And I think, having listened to Justin and you together today, I think we all would be running right alongside you away from that leadership retreat. But can you both give me a so now what that would allow us to lead, or help you to lead, in a way that feels steady rather than dominant?
So my answer is a bit of a rogue one, but if you hear me out, I'll kind of explain the thinking behind it. Alongside the theme of kind of why arts and publishing and literature are important ways to think about the historical activism of the 70s and 80s that I'm working on, I've been really struck by a piece of art recently, which is the movie Hamnet, which by the time this podcast comes out is probably not going to be in theaters anymore, but you absolutely should watch. And where better to talk about leading egos or leading leaders than being the director on a movie set? And so the movie itself is beautiful, and I won't spoil anything about it, but I've mostly been struck by how the director, Chloe Zhao, who is still the only woman of color to have won a Best Directing Oscar, I've been struck about the way she talks about how she leads on set and in bringing her visions to life. So she talks about what she calls a feminine consciousness in her leadership. And I think we can debate what she means by feminine, but to me, it's speaking to kind of a Chinese philosophy of yin and yang, where she says that leadership should be inspired by interdependence, by community, by intuition, rather than by dominance and by ego. And you see it in her work. I think it's really, when you go see a movie and you see the vision and the way that the leadership behind the movie has shaped the product, it's really, really special. And it's so emotionally interior. It's so beautiful, and it's in the way it depicts the natural world. And so I think she's challenging us to say, what if our archetypes of leaders in whatever sphere aren't generals or CEOs? What if caregivers? What if, the idea of the high priestess? Those things can be the people and figures we look towards when we think of leaders. What would our world look like if that were the case? And so I've been thinking about that question a lot recently, and I hope that everyone else can join me in thinking about that question as well.
My goodness, I'm going back to watch Hamlet for a second time with that in mind. Thank you so much, Justin. That's a wonderful one. Yes. Yay to the high priestesses. Yay to some of that feminine energy. What about you, Jen?
What do leaders need to lead better? And I'm afraid I don't have a lovely reference to art and culture like Justin does. But I think I try, when I'm being led, right, to for the most part, right, assume good faith on those who are leading, and to put a finer point on it. I once had someone say to me, "Don't confuse for malice what you can chalk up to incompetence," and again, the Hollywood archetype, not the one that Justin refers to. I'm thinking more of the Trump "you're fired" and the Succession, right? Gets us to think about leaders that are leading in bad faith. And of course, right, as a political scientist, if I look at who's running some of the world's most powerful countries, I'm not going to tell you that those men are not acting in bad faith. But in our day-to-day lives, in our organizations, our workplaces, our schools, our communities, right, most people are leading in good faith, but they might get things wrong. They might just not get things right because they're human and they make mistakes, right? Don't confuse for malice what you can attribute to incompetence. And I think once you assume that the people around you are trying their best, there's a good faith effort to get it right, you can find ways to work with them collaboratively. And then not everything, right, is an instant conflict or an instant crisis, right? But things are trouble spots that you can work through together. And I think sometimes just assuming that the person who's leading acted in good faith, but maybe got it wrong, opens up a whole new avenue for much more productive solutions, because at the end of the day, you both probably care about achieving the same objective, even if you disagree on the best way to get there. And so when you have that eye on the prize and you can make a good faith assumption, I do think interpersonally, at least, our workplaces, our schools, our communities can get a little bit nicer.
Spoken like a true Gates scholar there, Jen. Thank you so, so much. That was an absolutely wonderful way for both of you to bring us in to close this episode. Episode 3, Season 3 of So Now What? And part, of course, of our close-up look at leadership, with leading in the media and leading for hope still to come. Many, many thanks to my two brilliant guests today, political scientist, policy consultant, media commentator and director of the Gender Institute at Royal Holloway, University of London, Jennifer Piscopo, and researcher and indefatigable steady leader Justin Wei, who is currently writing his PhD thesis on Black Asian solidarity in late 20th century Britain at the Department of History at Cambridge. Power to those typing fingers, Justin. My thanks too to producers Mandy Garner from Gates Cambridge and Nick Saffel from the Central Communications Office at the University of Cambridge, and thanks to all of you for listening. I'm Catherine Galloway, and this was So Now What with Gates Cambridge. Join us again next time for another episode on the leaders and leadership we need right now, brought to you by those who are already busy doing it.